pandemic comes, if it's like purulence, it will not.
So hello everyone, my name's Miles Taylor, and I've been given the pleasurable task of chairing the final session of today's colloquium, which has been, I think we'll all agree, thoroughly enjoyable, and great credit to Ian and Robert and colleagues at Sussex for putting this all together. I think we should have been in the Fulton building, really, to give full impact to today's theme. Anyway, as Ian threatened right at the beginning, we're ending up back in the 19th century, which of course is a particular source of enjoyment to me. We've got three very fine speakers to see us out. You've got their bios there, but I'll just say a little bit. And I'll introduce them all now. Lauren Goodlad from Rutgers in the USA, who is currently working on a really exciting sounding project on AI across the centuries, but today she's going to return to themes of her very influential work on character and governance in Victorian Britain. So she'll lead us off, and then we have Stuart Jones from the University of Manchester, known to many of you for his innovative intellectual history of the 19th century, particularly his book on Mark Patterson, and now completing a new biography of James Bryce, who has so much to say about corruption and governance, and particularly in the Anglo-American tradition, and so we'll hear from him second up. And then we close out today with our convener for the whole event, who is Ian Cawood from University of Stirling. And I guess, Ian, you really wanted the book to be published last week, so you'd have it on display and we could all get cheaper copies than we're otherwise going to be able to. But his forthcoming edited collection, The Many Lives of Corruption and Reform of Public Life in Modern Britain, 1750 to 1950, I guess is partly a companion volume for the AHRC project. And,
yes, it is.
Looking forward to that very, very much. So I think each speaker's been allotted about 20-25 minutes. I think we'll stay with the convention of having the questions at the end of the three papers, and we'll keep an eye on what's coming in on the chat. But over to you, Lauren. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so very much, and thank you, Ian, and thank you, audience, virtual and real. And let me apologize for not having been able to get here to spend the entire day with you. That would have very fondly been my wish, but I had some competing engagements and then some train issues. So I'm glad to be here in time, and it's a great pleasure. So I'm just going to set my timer so that I get a reminder at 20 minutes and don't go over, because I'm going to speak mainly quite informally, since I have not done original research on the civil service per se for quite some time. And so I'm going to be drawing off my own work and talking a little bit about some lingering questions that I hope you can help me to answer. The first thing I'm going to do is say a couple of places where, if you're interested in some work of mine that I think does abut the subject of the 19th century state and the 19th century civil service, you might go if you are interested. So Ian has suggested that I focus on Trollope, and Trollope is an ongoing interest of mine. And I want to mention that there is an Ashgate research companion to Trollope in which I have a chapter called Trollope and Politics. And in that chapter, I actually go in depth to what kind of liberal Trollope was, which is actually a very hard question to answer, because if you know anything about the 19th century Liberal Party, you know that it was constantly changing its colors. It never really emerged into something that you could stably call liberalism. And, you know, there's also a lot of question about what liberalism is even right now. And if you know anything about Trollope, you know that he was a very idiosyncratic figure vis-a-vis these various liberal trends, even though he's now very often considered to be the archetypal Victorian liberal, which in some ways makes sense, given that liberalism itself was a little bit of a hash, and Trollope does a beautiful pastiche of that. So that chapter is really quite granular for a literature scholar in going into the liberal politics of Trollope's context and a few things that he wrote in various novels, including, of course, the Palliser novels. I also have worked a lot on John Stuart Mill, a crucial figure for understanding all sorts of things about liberalism then and now, and have a couple of chapters in my most recent monograph, The Victorian Geopolitical Aesthetic, in which Trollope is a major figure. That is Oxford University Press, 2016 for the paperback, 2015 for the hardback, just doing a bit of stuff that Oxford likes its authors to do. So Mill is actually, again, a civil servant, as you doubtless know, was sort of put into the East India Company as a lad by his father, where he stayed for more than 30 years until he voluntarily left when the East India Company was being reorganized after the Indian Rebellion in a way that Mill actually thought was quite wrong-headed. And he wrote some very interesting things about that, was very against there being so much power concentrated in the hands of the Secretary of State for India. And of course, the first Secretary of State for India ended up being, he was then Viscount Cranborne, later Lord Salisbury, and he kind of learned about India on the fly, right? So interesting archives for me to look at that I looked at it across several different chapters, bearing on Mill and also on a few crises in India that occurred, which affected a Trollope novel, one that you may know, called The Eustace Diamonds. So in Q&A, if you're interested in the Eustace Diamonds, I can perhaps unpack a little bit of that for you. Last but not least, there is my chapter on the civil service in the book that I know some of you know. Thank you so much for reading it. I feel like I was quite a lass when I wrote that book. It was published in 2003, but I actually finished it in 2001. It just took them a long time to get it between covers. And it has a chapter in it, my favorite actually, on Trollope and the civil service. Other chapters in it are on the New Poor Law. In some ways, Charles Trevelyan is the star of the book. He comes up again and again and again because of that long career that he had, you know, starting in India, then moving into domestic politics, then trying to work on India, but actually being asked to leave because his older way of thinking about how to govern the empire was by then out of date, and then concluding his career as an important founding member of the Charity Organization Society, which was a group, if you haven't heard of it, that ran counter to the idea that poor law administration should be done by a national bureaucracy, or even for that matter, a local bureaucracy. The vision of the Charity Organization Society, which comes from out of the evangelical background that Trevelyan and several others in his well-known family were raised in, which was that the best way to elevate people in need, working class people, people who had fallen on hard times, was via personal contact through middle and upper middle class people and those people themselves. And this goes all the way back to, I mean, it goes back even before this, but certainly a key figure for this context is Thomas Chalmers, whose way of organizing the church in Scotland was a kind of a model with lots of visiting. And this idea of visiting, you know, being a district visitor, as it is sometimes called, runs very long in British culture, even when the state was starting to pick up some girth. For example, although you might not notice it, and perhaps you haven't read this novel, if you read E.M. Forster's Where Angels Fear to Tread, one of the first novels that he wrote, what you will notice is that the heroine of that novel, Carolyn, is in fact a district visitor. You know, in her spare time, she goes and visits the homes of the poor, something that ladies of her class did. And this becomes a kind of a context for the experiences that she has in Italy, where she has to learn to sort of liberate herself from the mentality that suggests that a person educated in the upper middle class, the lower upper class, whatever you want to call Forster's class, that you would have the ability to civilize just by being who you are. And that's something that Forster has very mixed feelings about, which is very constitutive of the kind of liberal that he is. So I'm going to read something that Anthony Trollope wrote about the civil service when the Northcote-Trevelyan report was being debated. It's the only thing in nonfiction that he wrote specifically about this topic, other than a few passing comments in his autobiography. The Northcote-Trevelyan reporters clearly want to have the article, namely a good government clerk, ready-made to their hand, so that they may have no trouble with him after his appointment. He is to walk up to his desk on his first morning, armed at all points for every description of official fight, prepared to settle difficult points of international law in French or German, or to work out correctly any abstruse calculation required by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to draw out a new constitution in elegant English, or if needs be, to quote Latin and Greek. He is, moreover, to be of excellent moral character, a member of some Christian community, certified as to age, sound of wind and limb, ambitious as regards the civil service, but humble and docile as to his own feelings, serious and sedate, though under 20, punctual in attendance, and not too much given to heavy lunches at 2 o'clock, which I suspect that Trollope himself, in his work for the post office, despite being a very, very vigorous post office official, as we know, probably ate those lunches. He did, after all, have time to write a lot of novels while doing his job. Often it is said, he said, while he was on the train traveling for the civil service with a little lap desk and a pencil. So I'm now going to read a nice summary of that chapter and where it stands vis-a-vis the Northcote-Trevelyan report and Trollope's position on it, which was actually not quite correct, but not quite correct in a common way. A lot of people misunderstood the Northcote-Trevelyan report, and that's in part because the people who wrote it wanted to create a certain amount of, not so much confusion, but they were really trying to make people happy along two fronts, which was very hard to do. After the disasters of the Crimea and the kind of outcry that you might associate with Dickens's Little Dorrit, the Circumlocution Office, and so forth, there was a very strong outcry for middle-class, entrepreneurial kinds of influences, new blood, as opposed to the perception and to some degree the reality that what you had in the civil service was a lot of third and fourth sons and cousins who were not very talented at anything and therefore needed to be shuffled off into some kind of position. As against that, the Northcote Trevelyan report pitted a focus on competitive exams as being the answer for that. But what they were more quiet about was the extent to which those exams were going to be appropriate for people with a degree from Oxford or Cambridge. And therefore, what they were actually angling for was a certain class of gentlemen. So they were surprisingly wrapped up in something that I think is very, very important to the British 19th century state, the civil service, and to some degree, all of higher education, because this runs through Matthew Arnold. It runs through the notion of what an education should be. Mill has a version of it, though he never went to Oxford or Cambridge, which is this idea that the type of person that you want in the civil service is disinterested, and that education elevates that person in mentally in order to have a liberal way of thinking, in that sense of the word liberal, so that you can actually help to bring together people from different classes and different walks of life through a state that, without being interventionist, without overreaching, actually does the work of knitting people together and bringing what Arnold called sweetness and light to it, but with a light hand. And so that idea, which comes from out of Coleridge's idea of a clerisy, is extremely important, but was not advertised when the Northcote Trevelyan report came out. It was an idea that was sort of put in there specifically by Benjamin Jowett, but with the blessings of Gladstone and others that all sort of saw this as a way of having it both ways. And so now I'm going to read this little summary that will tell you a little bit more about Trollope and why the one novel that he wrote about the civil service, which is The Three Clerks, gives you the sense that he didn't understand the report at all. So Trollope may be said to have advocated the ostensible ends of the Northcote Trevelyan report, a more efficient service staffed by qualified men, while strongly dissenting as to its express means, right? He agreed that patronage was a great evil, in other words, the bad cousins, that ran counter to the spirit of the age. But like many contemporaries, he saw competitive examinations as reflecting a misguided entrepreneurial emphasis. Unlike Samuel Smiles, the author of Self-Help, Trollope was misled into believing that the report had been designed to favor men from a class educated in a less costly manner than those who fill our universities. And of course, universities at that time were much less democratic places than they are today. It was, you had to basically go to public school to end up at a university. Like the latter, however, Trollope believed that the system would encourage cramming, which in fact it did, which is a whole other question, right? Like what the people who wrote the Northcote Trevelyan report led others to believe, what they thought it would do, and then what it actually did, because in fact people did cram for the exam. So like the latter, however, Trollope believed that the system would encourage cramming rather than warrant knowledge or intellect. Trollope was thus entirely unable to perceive that the report's underlying assault on middle-class expertise and its attempt to constitute a civil service on Coleridgean grounds. I'm sorry, I think I misread that. he was unable to see those things about it. They are true. On the contrary, he portrayed the reformers as uncompromising zealots who, more like than unlike the notorious Edwin Chadwick, who represents what the state was trying to do at the most statist part of the early Victorian period in the 1830s and 1840s. Trollope was a Benthamite bureaucrat, as Trevelyan was at the beginning of his career, but was so unpopular that he basically was forced into retirement. I mean, people just did not want to have that type of expertise telling them what to do in a country that had been used to a large degree of local self-government. So that's what Trollope thought you were going to get, a lot of Chadwicks. Trevelyan, as he is depicted in Trollope's The Three Clerks, was the governor of a utopia, and his fictional counterpart, Sir Gregory Hardlines, a civil service Pharisee. Benjamin Jowett was also cast in a Gradgrindian light as Mr. Jobbles. Mr. Jobbles had divided the adult British male world into classes and subclasses and could tell at a moment's notice how long it would take him to examine them all. Such caricatures representing Northcote Trevelyan as a utilitarian measure reveal how Trollope's understanding of the report, like that of many contemporaries, fell wide of the actual mark. Certainly by the time of the autobiography, at which point the law had been passed and people could see for themselves what it had led to, and Trollope himself was retired from the post office, certainly by that time, Trollope was ready to say that while he had never learned to love competitive examination, he became and is very fond of Sir Charles Trevelyan. So, they kind of grew toward each other. I think if you're a Trollope novel reader, the place where you will find more Trollope, who in the civil service mode, is when he's not writing about the civil service qua civil service, but in his Barsetshire novels, where the clergy, although represented as a kind of a mixed bag, are, with the exception, of course, of Mr. Harding, who is a most ethical man. Would that all our civil servants had his ethics, although they do, of course, drive him to retire. Trollope's way of depicting the clergy in the Barsetshire novels gives a strong sense of what he believed the model civil service could be, insofar as it could act like a clerisy, which of course is, after all, the term clerisy comes from the idea of modeling a secular state on the clergy. So I think that that's where you get the truly good sense. There are also some figures in the Palliser novels. Plantagenet Palliser is, of course, an extremely ethical gentleman, not a very successful prime minister, though he does push through the decimal coinage about 100 years before someone actually pushed through the decimal coinage. So something to be said for that, as Trollope's idea of giving Plantagenet an issue on which he could be successful, not probably realizing that it was a tough nut to crack. The last thing I'll say is that if anybody is interested, I am, as Miles said, now working on artificial intelligence, which is really data-driven machine learning, not, forget Hollywood, forget all of these. This is not, we're not speaking of human-like intelligence, we're speaking of statistically analyzed data sets, mostly taken through unconsented surveillance of all of us as we walk around with our phones and do things on the internet. And I cannot but imagine that the ethics of the civil service in the future are going to be deeply tied up in the machine learning programs that are being created for them to use, and will be, I assure you, relentlessly pushed as ethical, fair, good decision-making, whether they are or aren't. You know, they have the potential to be. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And your last comment actually picks up some of the discussion we had this morning about civil service, government, social media, compliance. So maybe we can come back to that.
I'm so sorry I missed it.
No. Over to you, Stuart.
Now, all my slides on here. Yes, here it goes.
If you just start.
Yes. Great, thank you. So thank you, and thank you, Ian, for inviting me to this fascinating day. Actually, when Ian first approached me to speak at this symposium, he asked me to address the subject of the impact of T.H. Green, the Oxford idealist philosopher, on public administration. And I said, well, I didn't think I had anything very new to say about that subject, but I was currently working on a project on James Bryce, who I think fits the theme of today quite well, as I shall try to demonstrate. Bryce's career, and I'm assuming that he's unlikely to be known to everybody here, Bryce's career straddled the world of academia and public life in quite a distinctive way. He was an Oxford professor, a Gladstonian Liberal MP, cabinet minister, ambassador to Washington, a Royal Commission chair. He was also a founding fellow and later president of the British Academy, and so on. Many of these roles alongside each other. So he was actually sitting in the cabinet during his last year as Regius Professor of Civil Law at Oxford. I think probably a unique concurrence. He was well known in a number of different fields. He was very well known internationally as a humanitarian campaigner, notably on behalf of the Armenian people. He was important as a pioneer of access to open spaces. He was a peace campaigner and one of the wartime advocates of the League of Nations, and so on. But primarily, I think he's important as an early exponent of the comparative study of political systems, especially democratic political systems, also federal political systems, and one for whom his academic expertise as a historian and as a jurist complemented the expertise that he acquired as a political practitioner, and also, incidentally, as an obsessive traveller who had unusually acute powers of observation and an unusually good ability to extract information from the people he met and spoke to. He was close to T.H. Green, incidentally, and they were contemporaries. Forgetting. They were contemporaries at Oxford. Green, a couple of years older than Bryce. Here they are standing together on the back row. That's Bryce, that's Green. They were fellow members of the Old Mortality Society, which is an essay society. Other members included A.V. Dicey, the jurist, and Swinburne, the poet. It's a very distinguished cohort of Oxford undergraduates. Incidentally, Oxford, in its relatively undemocratic character at the time, has been mentioned. Bryce was from a very dissenting Presbyterian background, Scots Ulster Presbyterian background, and he's one of the first generation of non-Anglican undergraduates at Oxford in the 1850s, and incidentally, even prior to the passage of the University Tests Act of 1871, he was a fellow of his college and indeed a professor before that act was. And he's really the first nonconformist fellow of an Oxford College. So his background is quite important in that respect. Anyway, back to the theme of, as it were, public ethics. Of this kind of cohort of undergraduates, or liberal undergraduates in Oxford and indeed Cambridge, Green and Sidgwick at Cambridge became the two preeminent ethicists of their time. Bryce, although he was a polymath, had no great claim to be a moral philosopher, but his political writings were underpinned, I think, by a very well-defined ethical outlook, and one that's not that far from removed from that of Green, a broadly Republican outlook. I'll say more about that in a moment, but put Republican in the political theorist sense, in which concepts such as civic virtue and corruption did a great deal of work, and there's an important relationship between those which are kind of almost antitheses. He had a great deal to say about the ethics of public life and of public office, and that's true, I think, in two particular contexts. The first, which I'm not going to dwell on today, the first is the understanding of public office that he developed in his work on the governance of charitable trusts and other bodies that were providing what were in effect public services, especially in the field of education. So he begins doing this as an assistant commissioner for the Schools Inquiry Commission in the 1860s. Green, incidentally, was one of the other assistant commissioners, and Bryce's report is notably influential on that report. In that report and in other kind of work around that subject, we can see a modern notion of public office being formed in the struggle against effectively kind of old corruption in terms of the ways in which charitable trusts and so on were governed. He's important, incidentally, as in shaping the governance of civic universities. He writes the constitution for Owens College, which is the predecessor of my current university, University of Manchester. I mean, that's kind of a pioneering, that is really important in establishing the model for the ways in which the civic universities in England have been governed. So that's one context in which ideas about kind of public office and public service emerge in Bryce's writings. But I think, or his writings and his practical work. I think more important. I think what I want to concentrate on rather more today are his very extensive writings on comparative politics, starting with his American Commonwealth in 1888, and culminating in his Modern Democracies, which is published in 1921, the year before he died. Bryce was the most important British authority on comparative political systems of his time, and in particular, he was the leading authority on American politics and society. And in these works, he had plenty to say about corruption, about civic virtue, about the ethics of public life. And I want to concentrate on them today because Victorian and indeed post-Victorian commentators commonly deplored the corruption that they found in American and other overseas political systems. The Third Republic in France was another example which was often cited. Many of these criticisms came from critics of democracy. Bryce wasn't one of those in any straightforward sense. He had a much more nuanced perspective than the critics of democracy. But a study of how he and his contemporaries understood corruption abroad I think helps us to sharpen our understanding of what they saw as the strength of the British system and the dangers that faced it as well. In particular, Bryce's studies of the workings of democracy in America, but also in Australia and in New Zealand, in France and in Switzerland, in Canada and in South America, those are the cases that he covers in Modern Democracies, show him confronting the particular forms of corruption or perversions of public life to which he thought democracies were especially vulnerable. Now, he was clear that he didn't by any means equate corruption with democracy, although some of his contemporaries tended to do that. He says, you know, Tsarist Russia, for example, he says was a byword for corruption, whereas Switzerland, which was the country whose political system he most admired, and the one where he thought democracy worked best, Switzerland was notably free of it. But just as autocracies were susceptible to certain forms of corruption, he thought that democracies were susceptible to others. Now, there's an important point about the context here. Bryce's big work on the United States was written really in the period from about 1883 to 88. This was a decisive moment in the transition to democracy in Britain. After the passage of the Third Reform Act of 1884-5, most British commentators took it for granted that they were living in a democracy, and the inexorability of the process of democratization was, I think, accepted in a way that it hadn't been 20 years or so before. Of course, we now know that only about 60% of adult men had the vote, and no women in national elections. But the enlargement of the electorate in 1884 had been very substantial. It was a bigger enlargement of the electorate than 1860 or 1867, though not as big as in 1918. That it made Britain into a democracy was a salient point in the political commentary of the time, not least, incidentally, in Bryce's writings for the New York weekly, The Nation. He acts as British political correspondent for it in the 1880s, and this is a major theme in his writings there. Now, the language of corruption. In preparing for this event, I kind of did some word searches for the word corruption in Bryce's writings and in other contemporary works, and I was actually quite struck at just how much the corruption and its cognates, corrupt, corruptible, and so on, occur in the American Commonwealth and in modern democracies. Also, in particular, in this book by Ostrogorsky, which Bryce had an important role in. So it pervades Bryce's texts, as it does those of some other pioneers in the study of political systems, including critics of democracy like Maine and Lecky, important in Lecky, but Bryce, as I've said, doesn't belong in that camp. He was always sought to present himself as a sympathetic but neutral observer of democratic, or a student of democratic politics. The prominence of the concept of corruption is quite striking, I think. So what is he trying to do? So this is, he's writing after the kind of Robert Lowe civil service reforms, after the passage of the Corrupt Practices Act of 1883. What's he doing with the language of corruption? How does he use the concept and in what contexts? Well, in a strikingly large number of cases, references to corruption occurs in close proximity to, linguists would say in collocation with, discussion of civic virtue, civic apathy. If you look at the index to modern democracies. I've just brought 2 pages together there. You find over here corruption, large number of references, but you also find a large number of entries on the civic apathy, civic duty. So he says, for example, that, I mean, just a couple of examples. Switzerland, he says, he notes the absence of titles, decorations, ribbons, medals, and so on, which in France and England, he says, have been instruments of a sort of corruption. Whereas in Switzerland, he finds a constant teaching in the schools of civic duty. So civic duty is contrasted with corruption. He wrote, incidentally, it's an interesting variant, he wrote that American politicians spoke not in the spirit of disinterested virtue, but in the hard commercial spirit which pervades the meetings of a joint stock company. This was in a discussion of what he called the tone of public life, a recurrent locution in Bryce's work, by which he typically meant the presence or absence of forms of corruption. It's an interesting anticipation, perhaps, of the modern notion of standards in public life. The tone of public life is what Bryce talks about. He argues that democratic government must assume that at least a majority of the ruling people will know and discharge their duty. Well, in view of that belief, it's not surprising to find in Bryce a leading proponent of civics or citizenship education. Not only that, incidentally, but you find, so this is kind of, he wrote this pamphlet really called Hindrances to Good Citizenship, which is a product of some lectures he gave in the United States. But you also find his American Commonwealth being used in abridged form in American high school civics programs. And this is not surprising because the terminology that I've been discussing, corruption, civic virtue, civic apathy, and so on, is the staple vocabulary of the Republican tradition of political thought. A tradition that's distinct, incidentally, from both republicanism in the American party sense and distinct also from republicanism in the familiar British sense of opposition to monarchy. The Republican tradition is conventionally seen as opposed to and indeed supplanted by 19th century liberalism, although this has been this kind of conventional opposition has been much challenged of late. Bryce was very much a mainstream liberal, both with a small L and a capital L, and his political writing was replete with Republican tropes. Conviction that civic virtue was easier to sustain in small than in large communities. For example, Bryce cited the vigilance of citizens in small communities as an explanation of the absence of corruption in Switzerland, whereas conversely, he said in America, experience shows that the larger the community, the more apt the citizen to neglect his duties because there are so many others equally bound to discharge them. Similarly, he held that poverty and purity, the absence of corruption, go together. The two best administered democracies in the modern world, he thought, had been the two poorest. The Swiss Confederation, and you probably won't guess the other one, it's the Orange Free State before 1899. Incidentally, if you ask, well, where does Bryce's republicanism come from? I think it's strongly inflected by his particular kind of Presbyterian background, something I can't really kind of elaborate on here for reasons of space, but I think that is a very important kind of source of this Republican outlook. Okay, I want now to turn to how he analyses corruption in America and other democratic societies. And in the period from Bryce's first visit to the United States, which was in 1870, to the publication of the American Commonwealth in 1888, the two institutionalized practices that British opinion most deplored in American politics were the spoils system and the caucus. And these are both subjects that Bryce has a lot to say about. The first was the practice effectively inaugurated by the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828, whereby all federal officers were considered to be at the disposal of an incoming president who was entitled to use these powers of patronage to reward his political allies. Bryce thought this as, quote, a system which perverts public office from its proper function of serving the public. The system, he thought, had lowered the general tone of public morals. Now, by Bryce's time, certainly the time he's writing the American Commonwealth, there was in fact a good deal of momentum behind the campaign for civil service reform that would cleanse the system by radically curtailing the number of officers held to become vacant on the expiry of a presidential term. The Pendleton Act of 1883 was the first triumph of the campaign to end the spoils system, and it was reinforced the following year by Grover Cleveland's victory over James Blaine, a victory made possible by the so-called mugwumps who deserted the Republicans in protest against the political corruption that they associated with Blaine's name in particular. Bryce had close contacts with the mugwump, including especially with the Irish-born newspaper editor Edwin Godkin, for whose New York weekly, The Nation, which I mentioned earlier, Bryce served as British political correspondent. This is Godwin's, the inscription on Godwin's tombstone in Northamptonshire. He died on a visit to Britain. And this is written by Bryce, and it refers to his efforts to make government just, pure, and efficient, amongst other things, which I mean is kind of I think sums up this this outlook. So in one sense, Bryce was writing at a time when the dusk was falling on the spoils system, although it was slower to be eradicated at state and municipal levels, where far more positions were involved. So he reasonably regarded the system as still intact, although he thought it had been much shaken. In any case, even after the Pendleton Act, the spectre of the spoils system was much invoked in British political controversy, not least incidentally in the Home Rule controversy. You find the Times, which is a committed to the liberal unionist cause, which argues that Home Rule would transplant the spoils system to Ireland. Bryce's chapter on the spoils system was much noticed by British readers, and so too was the discussion of the party machine, the caucus. Not surprisingly, because by the 1880s, the caucus, inaugurated in Britain by Birmingham Liberals under Joseph Chamberlain in the wake of the Second Reform Act, was a familiar spectre in British political commentary. The danger was that the parties were tightening their grip on the political system. Bryce was one of the first academic students of politics who really took the party seriously as a political institution. He helped inspire the work that I mentioned earlier by Ostrogorsky, a Russian emigre who wrote in French. Bryce wrote the preface to the English translation of Ostrogorsky's book, which actually appeared slightly before the French edition. And curiously, Bryce, it's an unusual thing for a preface writer to do. Effectively, he slaps down Ostrogorsky for saying that the British caucus is the same thing as the US caucus. It was crucial to Bryce's argument that institutions could not be properly understood in isolation from the wider political culture, our term rather than his, and specifically he thought the caucus had established its ascendancy in the United States because of the extensive spoils that were available to the winning party. That meant that civil servants, and aspiring civil servants too, were notably active in supporting and indeed financing parties. In Britain, he says, the absence of significant spoils, as well as the comparative infrequency of elections, in comparison with the United States, that the incentives for the creation of an elaborate party machine were much weaker. He made this point in particular in 1882, a piece so slightly predating Pendleton, in which he tried to correct the excessively negative view of standards in American public life that British readers had taken away from Henry Brooks Adams's novel Democracy, published in 1880. The spoils system in America, Bryce said, had created a large class of persons who have a direct personal interest in political warfare. He goes on to kind of talk, to contrast the way in which civil servants in the United States have often a financial incentive to be actively involved in political parties, whereas in Britain there was an effective ban on civil servants being actively involved in party politics. So Britain, he thought, was protected from the spoils system by entrenched conventions about civil service neutrality, and that effectively was protection against the development of the caucus. In the American Commonwealth, Bryce devoted a whole chapter to the subject of corruption, and he distinguished between the different kinds of political unsoundnesses. There was bribery in money, pecuniary corruption. There was bribery of politicians or public officials in return for favours or political decisions. There was a bribery of voters. That was corruption in a strict sense, and on the whole he found little of it in the democracies that he studied. But more interesting perhaps is to focus on the collocations that referred to political phenomena that were akin to corruption, and whether or not they counted as corruption in a strict sense tended to corrode the ethics of public life in one way or another. The principal of these was what he called jobbery, or the doing of a job. In other words, quote, the misuse of a public position for the benefit of individuals. This colloquial term embraced a variety of different kinds of abuses of legislative or executive office, but typically they involved the promise of government contracts in exchange for political support. Variants included the channeling of government contracts and the employment that they created to areas that voted for a party in office, or a member of Congress might promise to vote to support or to defeat a legislative measure that brought private benefit to the recipient of the job. Bryce noted that because in these instances the public office holder derived not private gain but political benefits, these cases were often regarded as less vicious than bribery, but he nevertheless thought that they corroded the tone of public life, that phrase again, something that was clear from the amount of attention that he devoted to the subject. Again, just doing word counts, the simple word jobbery occurs 26 times in the American Commonwealth and 19 times in modern democracies. He thought that the prevalence of private legislation in the USA, without the constraints that had been placed on the practice in Britain, was an open invitation to abuse. He writes, the carnival of jobbery and corruption which such bills have induced in state legislatures has done more than anything else to discredit these bodies. Other kinds of corruption that Bryce identified included log rolling, which is basically I'll support you to get your private bill or tariff through if you support me on mine. There was the bestowal of places from personal motives, in other words, to political supporters, effectively the spoils system and similar. Bryce thought that in all countries, opinion tended to be lenient on these rewards for party service as opposed to rewards for private friendship, but he certainly regarded them as an abuse. And finally, there was insincerity in public professions. Was it corrupt, he asks, to advocate measures in spite of one's own conscience or better judgment, out of party loyalty or out of hope of political advancement? Bryce's concerns about jobbery and similar abuses, I think, raise the question of the relationship between late Victorian norms around public ethics on the one hand, and the liberal political economy of free trade and a small state. Bryce was largely out of sympathy with the collectivist turn in the Liberal Party, of which Green was one of the intellectual inspirations. He opposed it not so much on narrow economic grounds, but because he thought that collectivist politics created new kinds of temptations for governments and legislators and potentially gave rise to new forms of corruption. He deplored protectionism for this reason. In the USA, tariffs like railroad construction, he thought, created opportunities for log rolling deals, which were in effect conspiracies against the public good. Now, turning forward to modern democracies, it's striking in the notes that he assembled over many years for modern democracies. An important element in Bryce's method was to fire off letters posing a series of questions to a range of political figures from the country that he was writing about. And the dangers of corruption in government and the public services was evidently one of the concerns that he asked about. Certainly when writing about Australia, he was assiduous in collecting information about public sector strikes in Australia at the beginning of the 20th century, and also the numbers of public employees on electoral rolls, as well as the regulations on the political activities of civil servants. He thinks really that the expansion of public services is eroding that relationship between, or effectively eroding the possibility of a disinterested state. I've come to the conclusion, it's interesting, one of his Australian correspondents writes, echoing, I think, Bryce's own concerns, I've come to the conclusion that the greatest difficulty ahead of the movement towards state collectivism is not the economic fallacies that underlie it, nor the unstable equilibrium inherent in it, but the constitutional or the politico-economical difficulties. Are the servants of the state to be their own paymasters? Actually, there's a huge debate in France at exactly the same time on this subject about the kind of, if you like, the constitutional implications of growth of public services. I'm going to have to bring this to a close. So what I've tried to do really in this talk has been to demonstrate how important corruption, used in a quite distinctively Republican sense, was to Bryce's political analysis. So I've drawn attention to what Bryce's commentary on the American and other overseas democratic systems has to tell us about the new kinds of corruption that they think democracies were particularly susceptible to. As we've seen, Bryce was critical of those of his contemporaries like Maine and Lecky, who wanted to draw simple lessons from the American experience and who wanted either to borrow or to condemn particular institutions without understanding the, if you like, cultural context of in which they worked in America. But Bryce did articulate an understanding of the challenges that democratic politics would face. So the effective operation of democracy depended upon widespread civic virtue and was undermined by civic apathy. That wasn't true of other kinds of political system, although it applied to a lesser degree in representative systems with more restricted franchises. The fusion of democratic politics with the growth of the state created new temptations of various kinds, typically the granting of public contracts in exchange for financial support for a political party. And finally, Bryce wasn't centrally concerned with civil service ethics, the central theme of this conference. On the whole, in the countries he studied in modern democracies, he found good standards of integrity in the civil service, as opposed to ministers and parliamentarians. But of course, the contest over the spoils system was precisely concerned with defining the proper relationship between ministers and civil service. Whilst most democratic states, by the time Bryce wrote, had addressed that issue, he identified new challenges associated with the growth of state functions. which threatened, he thought, to destabilise that relationship in new ways. So that's where I'll... Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Stuart. It's a very comprehensive overview. We all look forward very much to the book. So, Ian, you
Yes.
started the day, and now you're still here.
Yeah. Well, I think if I'd gone home, I think everybody else would have gone home by now.
So you've
Let's
got
be
to
honest.
close it up.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm doing this wrong.
Yeah, sure. I shall see what if I can do.
Do you want...
Yep, so that's a share that.
Sharing all right, I think.
It is sharing all right? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought you'd particularly, all those of us who do work in some form of public service, particularly enjoy the cartoon there, which is rather pained, I think, in its intentions. Thinking of what I've put my family through in my pursuit of my own public service career, I do recognise that one. It's the contrast between the public servant who sacrificed a lot and his wife and child that I particularly enjoy. Anyway, so my argument here then is going to be that if we go right back to Northcote Trevelyan, picking up on some of the points that Lauren mentioned, and also reflecting on the type of high-minded understanding of the dangers of democracy, but also of the problems of the old existing systems of aristocratic dominance that Bryce was engaging with, I think we need to just broaden out our perspective a little bit. Obviously, if we think about, again, going back to what I started with this morning, we think about what the key features of the modern civil service are. We often talk about the Westminster model. Now, of course, many people have questioned whether or not that actually is a reality, or whether or not that's a self-serving neo-colonialist myth, of course. But it is a set of principles of public administration which in some ways have been attempted to be captured more rigorously within the Nolan principles. But this predates the Nolan Committee on Standards in Public Life, of which we heard so much this morning. And these are, of course, appointment and promotion on merit, political impartiality and independence, anonymity, permanence, accountability, and this is written into the Civil Service Code. And I'd be very pleased to know I'm not going to attempt to deal with all of those, but I'm going to pick up some of the most important. I'm going to explain that these are more often found within provincial and lower rank civil service than perhaps they are in Whitehall itself. I think those cri de coeur that I quoted to you from people working at the coalface this morning were an attempt to sort of try to articulate what I'm trying to say, but I'll try and put this into some sort of practice. So I'll attempt to place, going right back to Northcote Trevelyan, because you've stuck with me now and you go right back to the root cause of all of this, the social and cultural context of which Lauren alluded, and to contend that, you know, a genuine public service ethos did emerge, but emerged not from top-down reform, nor even from intellectual oversight, or dare I say, the cultural leading oversight of a Trollope or a Bryce, but within branches of the provincial administration itself, those people who were actually experiencing what it was like to be, what was the term, Lauren? A visiting... You talked about E.M. Forster's character being a
district visitor.
District visitor. That struck home to me, because I'm going to explain that there were plenty of district visitors in the British administration in its early pre-Northcote Trevelyan period, and that they actually helped to create their own form of public service ethos, and that the 1854 report was actually an attempt to restrain and reformulate this to suit the needs of an elite class of Britain. That was the purpose of the Northcote Trevelyan report, to respond to that existing endogenous reform that was already taking place within the British state. And that the priority was to perpetuate the rule of the elite and not to serve the common needs of the British public. So, let's first of all be aware of what the responses to the civil servants were. We've already seen that Trollope, first of all, misinterpreted it, but then when he got the gist of it, he actually quite liked it because it suited his mindset. And we've heard about Edwin Chadwick. But let's just bear in mind that there was opposition from Conservatives who didn't like their patronage being taken away from them, like Horatio Waddington and Henry Addington at the Home Office and the Foreign Office, and Benjamin Hawes at the War Office, which was one of the great homes of patronage. But also Rowland Hill, the great architect of the reforms within the Post Office, and Ralph Lingham, who later, of course, becomes the great ally of Lowe in the Treasury at retaining aristocratic control. He, at this point, was the Secretary of the Privy Council, the Committee for the Privy Council on Education, and he claimed that many valuable public servants can be quoted in different departments as men whom this principle of selection would have excluded. And, of course, Edward Cardwell, who ends up becoming, of course, the minister who attempts significantly to reduce patronage in that most aristocratic of elements of the British state, which, of course, is the armed forces. Now, I was very struck by what James Booth said. By the way, you can easily access this document, very easily accessible. If you look up the Northcote Trevelyan report, when you download the PDF, you get all these comments as well. There's about 300 pages of them, so you'll be pleased to know I'm summarising them here for you. The main opposition was on this basis, which is a kind of version of what I said Lingham had said. Examination itself affords a considerable test of the moral qualities. And James Booth, who was Permanent Secretary to the Board of Trade, of which, of course, so much of the collectivist impulse eventually derived at the end of the 19th century, he points out that all these things, good judgment, good temper, integrity, a sense of duty, deference to superiors, consideration of those in a subordinate position, I'll return to that in a second, none of these can be found by passing an exam. And of course they couldn't, because that wasn't what Northcote Trevelyan was interested in. Chadwick, of course, guilty of his own Prussian version and his complete inability to sell his mission to the public, in contrast to Trevelyan, did, however, in an incredibly long reply to this document, hit the nail on the head. It would give precedence to the Poor Law Service to a gentleman who could tell me the names of Actaeon's hands, but not the names of the chief statues to be dealt with. It's a pity that Philip Rutnam's gone home. I would like to have tested him on this. The point is that, you know, the aim of this, Chadwick spotted. Chadwick got it straight away. The whole purpose of this was to retain the civil service for the elite class, not to introduce any degree of efficiency. I go on. Canon Moseley, who I quoted at the beginning of the day, pointed this out about some of the best men in his department. Now, he's an HMI. He is, you know, visiting. He knows life on the coal face. He points out that this class of men, your examination offers no opening whatsoever to them, notwithstanding there are departments and civil servants which are of practical knowledge are required. In other words, these particularly strong figures, these great inspectors who worked in this very early days of state intervention in education, they would have been excluded by the Northcote Trevelyan report. And of course, the Civil Service Gazette, which amazingly in these days was still a rather radical document. It doesn't last. It's about as long as the radicalism of Punch and the Times lasts. It bears all the appearance of an arrangement for enabling gentlemen who obtain but limited honours at the university successfully compete with steady-going, efficient but non-classically educated men. To which, of course, I feel like reading, well, slap the cuffs on Charles Trevelyan because they've spotted it. It's all there in the responses, and of course, completely ignored by Trevelyan and Gladstone and Lowe and Lingham. Lingham, of course, had learned the art of keeping his mouth shut and just doing what his boss told him by 1870. So, let's bear this in mind. The crucial thing is, of course, appointment. I've appointed many people when I was head of department, and I know the art of appointment. An appointment, of course, is supposed to be on merit. Now, let's bear in mind Ministers retained control of appointment until Lowe's reforms. And of course, certain ministries, such as the Foreign Office and the Education Department, retained ministerial selection of candidates. So you couldn't be a candidate for examination without the minister selecting you, which is a very clever way of maintaining patronage, until 1914. If you think I'm just making that up, the MacDonald Commission, which is well worth reading for the realities of what the British state was like by 1914, found that only a third of people appointed to the civil service by that point had been through any system of open competition whatsoever. The Crown, of course, contained and retained control of many crucial appointments within the British state, and still does, but let's not talk too openly about that. And of course, many junior posts were appointed as a matter of course. Jowett, of course, who we heard mentioned earlier, Jowett, of course, actually advised the religious test and insisted that there should be consideration of the applicant's place of education. That's Jowett of Balliol College, Oxford, everybody. Well, of course he would say that, wouldn't he? John Stuart Mill was furious, and read John Stuart Mill's furious attack on this in the responses. Jowett was deeply opposed to any form of egalitarianism. In 1859, he wrote to Walter Bagot, who's often claimed to be the person who created the Westminster system, saying that the passion for equality was the shallowest of all delusions. Okay, that's the basis of, these are the people who designed the basis of the modern civil service. This document that we're supposed to be celebrating, according to the leaders of the civil service and leaders of the current government. Palmerston took a more practical approach towards this. He wanted to combine merit with patronage, and argued, of course, that his preference for appointment was a trust imposed on me for the public advantage. He believed that he was the best judge. Palmerston is very underestimated. He has very high standards that he expects of his public servants. And his role as an administrative, he was not in favour of Northcote Trevelyan, which in some ways wins my favour. I'm not entirely sure he was in favour of open competition, but he still regarded that there should be constant testing, and most civil servants lived in fear of one of Palmerston's missives. Once you won Palmerston over, he would defend you to the hilt, and I'll show you an example of that in due course. The system, of course, that developed was, of course, a system of competition between nominated candidates. And of course, I'm sure many of you know the story of Hayter's idiots. This is the Treasury patronage secretary who kept two half-wits on the payroll, who he put up against any candidate he wanted to appoint. And on one famous occasion, one of them got appointed, which I thought was wonderful. That must have been a really low-quality candidate, that one. I wonder whether or not any of us have sat on panels where we all know who's going to get the job and wondered why the other people have bothered to be there. Possibly some of us even been in those interview situations ourselves, but perhaps hopefully we weren't half-wits. This is, for me, the smoking gun. Gladstone, who commissioned the report, wrote to Russell in 1854, "The great recommendation of the change in minds is its tendency to strengthen and multiply the ties between the higher classes and the possession of administrative power." Well, Gladstone, I believe that Gladstone's attitude changes. I believe Gladstone goes through a major re-evaluation of his ethical principles in the 1860s, but at this stage, this is his priority. I mentioned this quote earlier. Now, the interesting illustration of the nature of this problem and my argument that this had already been spotted and that another alternative had been created is evident in the Factory Office, of which I've written a study recently. And the Factory Office, of course, was a very interesting early embodiment of the state. The factory inspectors, of course, were set up to go out and maintain that mistreatment of children was not taking place, though in reality, many people argued that their main job was to maintain that the factories were safe, that they were sanitary, and that those excluded from work, i.e. the under-9s, were not being employed. But the problem was, of course, is that to employ people to carry out a basic duty of being somebody visiting a place of work and maintaining standards, proved almost impossible to actually find anybody to do the job. And I think this illustrates the poor quality of the kind of civic values, those republican values of civic virtue that existed in Britain at this state. This is the result of the long 18th century. You know, civic values have been so eroded by the qualities of patronage that existed that it was almost impossible to find anybody to do this job. And of course I could take the example of the early police force, but I just know the example of the factory office better. The first inspector of Yorkshire and Lancashire, quite an important place in factory inspection, was not physically capable of carrying out his duties, which is a funny choice of an inspector, isn't it, really? And James Stuart, of course, famously appointed in 1836, failed to prosecute a single mill owner in his 13 years as inspector of the Scottish Mills, and in fact wrote serious letters to the Home Secretary criticising his fellow inspectors for daring to prosecute people. He eventually was confronted by the other inspectors and had a heart attack, which demonstrates that perhaps justice catches up with them in the end. It, more importantly, proved almost impossible to recruit any honest men to carry out the day-to-day job of inspection. The sub-inspectors who actually did the visiting. There's only 4 inspectors covering the entire nation, so they have to employ people on a lower salary to do so. And of course, bribery, they're poorly paid government employees visiting the factories owned by some of the wealthiest people in the country. So unsurprisingly, the temptation to take a bribe, it's an area of that moral danger I talked about earlier. Embezzlement, they would take fines and then keep them for themselves. And of course, the poor quality of their work. They often failed to send reports. Most frequently, absenteeism was absolutely rife. The idea of turning up to work and working a day and not taking time off and not taking perks and not fiddling your expenses, that was completely unknown. It was always impossible to find anybody. So before Northcote Trevelyan, the factory office had already introduced a system of appointment on merit. Rather than being the nominated candidates given to them by the Home Secretary, because that's where the sub-inspectors came from, increasingly the inspectors insisted that they should be allowed systems to actually measure the appointments in the first place. There was a promotion system. There were senior sub-inspectors for those who proved to be diligent and hard-working. Obviously, the corrupt were increasingly being exposed to disciplinary standards. The inspectors lobbied the Home Secretary to introduce superannuation, the carrot to persuade people to be honest if they can't be honest because of their natural ethos. Travelling and personal expenses were introduced. Martin Knight and I once commented that getting decent travelling expenses, he says to many people who will be paid travel expenses from my grant, is a way of ensuring honesty. If people get travelling expenses, they're less likely to be wanting to try to get their expenses in some other fashion. This, of course, reminds me of what Stephen said earlier about the problems in Nigeria. And, of course, bureaucratic support. Believe it or not, when the factory office began, it had no stationery, it had no administrative support, some others working in academia may recognise this, and didn't even have an office. So it was a factory office that had no office. And all those things had to be fought for. They ended up with a clerk, a messenger, stationery, and believe it or not, even coals to heat the building. None of these things had been traditionally given to anybody. They were all expected to come out of the pocket of the person being employed. And of course, that is an encouragement to bribery and to embezzlement. So, here's an example of what I'm talking about. Here is the first Civil Service Commission report of 1855. And these are the standards required to work in Downing Street. Any comparisons with the standards required to work in Downing Street today are, of course, entirely yours to make parallels with. As you can see here, they require such things as the ability to write correctly, the ability to make a clear précis, and the physical qualities of the candidate should be adequate in the long attendance and late nights. The ability to cope with heavy drinking was mentioned. But the most important characteristic is a high sense of honour. I don't know if you've ever come across anything quite as subjective as that as a qualification. I'd like to put that in my entry requirements for the next job advertised and see what the HR department make of that one. Now, that demonstrates just how lax the standards were to get some of the best paid and most high-profile positions within the civil service when the Civil Service Commission investigated this. Civil Service Commission report of 1855, basically, I mean, I agree with what Baroness Stuart said. It's such an important body. It's probably the most important body that comes as a result of the Northcote Trevelyan, because it reveals the truth. Now, contrast that with the Factory Office. Here's the Factory Office. This is what they already do. Because remember, the Northcote Trevelyan reforms are not passed until 1870. This is 1855. Exercise test handwriting, orthography, both English composition, précis of papers. There's a test of arithmetic, a test of geography, a test of English history. I wonder whether or not English history is entirely appropriate for the Inspector of Scottish Mills. We'll leave that one aside. Latin and the elements of political economy. Wow. Now that's to be a factory inspector, and that had already been created before Northcote Trevelyan had written their report. I even found this in the Home Office archives in the National Archive, and this, of course, is the standards required. Horner, Howell, Kincaid and Redgrave. Redgrave, by the way, was the clerk who'd done a very good job and got appointed as a sub-inspector, done a good job, got appointed as a senior inspector, then eventually got appointed as one of the 4 inspectors and ends up becoming the chief inspector. So there was a model of promotion through the system. Unfortunately, he ended up being a terrible chief inspector, but I'll come back to him in a second. Look at that. The salaries, the expenses, the promotion system, the travelling expenses system. There is nothing like this elsewhere within the British establishment. And this is not created by Northcote Trevelyan. Can I stress that? Okay, so let me move on swiftly to other things. That, I think, is crucial, demonstrating that the principles of what we expect in terms of the appointment and promotion on merit are not established by Northcote Trevelyan. They arrive naturally out of the day-to-day experience of doing the work, of interacting with the public, of interacting with the wealthy and powerful. So, permanence. Obviously, of course, as Stuart's just mentioned, the fear of a spoils system had actually already led to the principle of permanence already being created. The Deputy Secretary of War had been in post, as you can see, for quite a while during this period. Obviously didn't get sacked for losing America, but there we go, we all have bad days. The Post Office Secretary was permanent after 1768. Board of Control Secretary after 1784. And of course, Burke's famous period of economic reform inspired by the loss of America, of course, had led to the abolition of sinecures, the introduction of superannuation, and the payment of salaries rather than the extremely corrupt system of demanding fees. Treasury Under Secretary was permanent after 1805, Home Office after 1806, Under Secretary after 1807, caused, of course, by the scandal revealed by the industrial embezzlement that Henry Dundas had been carrying on as Secretary to the Treasury. Had been acquiring something in the region of a salary of £4,000 a year, and of course it's noted just in very small print somewhere that he doesn't attend the office. So he didn't bother turning up for his enormous salary. I'll go on. Now, we heard mention of this. Kay Shuttleworth, Rowland Hill and Edwin Chadwick, those great reformers, were all forced out of office because they upset the vested interests that they encountered. And interestingly, the National Association of Factory Occupiers in November 1855 campaigned for the removal of Leonard Horner, the chief inspector, and because he was attempting to enforce the fencing of dangerous machinery. Now, the interesting point here is that that is the moment when it's made clear that you cannot have a government minister doing their job sacked. Kay Shuttleworth, Rowland Hill and Edwin Chadwick were sacked for doing their jobs. Horner wasn't. Partly out of patronage, I agree, but a patronage based on merit, because he had impressed Palmerston with his abilities. But it's only actually put into practice in the Haldane report. in 1918. And I think this plays an enormous role. This is from the Manchester Guardian, and this is the meeting where they're calling for the sacking of Horner, because he is a very old man. He is, what does it say? It talks about here, let all such men retiring pensions if they deserve them. He didn't think they had. So in other words, they're trying to strip Horner even of his pension at this point. Let Mr. Horner retire into private life, believing he took with him very little of the regret or respect of the manufacturing population of South Yorkshire. We do need to stress that when he did retire in 1859, he got numerous recommendations from the working class of South Lancashire. They wrote him and had printed wonderful encomiums to his tireless and selfless efforts. So, let's bear in mind that, again, permanence is not mentioned anywhere in the Northcote Trevelyan reports. We can say the same, sorry, that's appeared here, of impartiality and independence, as we know full well. And of course, I have to quote Yes Minister at some point during today. I'm surprised I'm the first person to do so. That, of course, impartiality is often a myth. Here, of course, Bernard says, we'll be laying down guidelines, and Hacker says, I thought inspectors were impartial. To which Woolley, of course, says, of course they are. Trains are impartial too, but if you lay down the lines, that's the way they go. Indeed. During the fencing controversy, George Grey, who was, of course, the Home Secretary, actually encouraged Horner to tone down his language and not to criticise the mill owners. When Horner challenged him, he said he couldn't force him to remove his comments from his reports, but he would not defend him in Parliament if he did so. In other words, independence had its limits. You know, you had to toe the line. And Howell, the other inspector, was admonished for writing a letter suggesting that the mill owners were interested only in their profits rather than the work they were carrying out. Let's bear in mind, by the way, Horner is the son of a mill owner. He has no reason to be antipathetic towards the mill owners, apart from, dare I say, actual practical experience. He wrote to Edwin Chadwick at the end of his life that 9/10 of mill owners care nothing about their workforce. And that was not based on prejudice, that was based on practical experience. So, let's just understand what happened to that independence. Well, of course, what happened is that in the Playfair report, Robert Baker, who'd taken on the mantle of Horner after his resignation as the champion of impartial service, was actually criticised for having not had his reports agreed by the Home Secretary. Alexander Redgrave, who, of course, had learnt the art of keeping his mouth shut and doing what his bosses wanted, got him fired. And Redgrave went on to carry on the tradition of James Stuart, famously referred to as the boss's inspector, the man who carried out less than a quarter of the prosecutions that Leonard Horner had done. John Simon at the local government board. John Simon, of course, was the first London medical officer for health. And John Lambert, who was a former poor law inspector, sidelined him. And Royston Lambert, Simon's biographer, says this: the men whose lax and sometimes corrupt supervision have been responsible for the appalling workhouse scandals of the past, and who were utterly without experience in sanitary affairs, usurped the place rightly due to Simon's long-tried inspectorate. Why? Because Lambert had the ear of the minister, the support of the Treasury, and the bureaucratic skills required of the effective mandarin. Matthew Arnold, who we heard mentioned of, he may have been in favour of some clerisy, but he was a liberal, as he said himself, tempered by experience. And that experience was, remember, as a schools inspector. And Ralph Lingham, of course, famously, encouraged by Robert Lowe, refused to expand the staff of the education department, which was virtually at a standstill by this point. And Arnold spent many years using his influence to try to overcome the philistinism of the payment by results scheme, which, of course, would gladden the heart of any modern education secretary. Political and administrative careers continue to be blurred despite the claims. Private secretaries were largely political appointments, much like special advisors today. And only in 1883, remember, were civil servants banned from acting as political agents. And only after 1884 were they obliged to resign if they stood for Parliament. None of that is in Northcote Trevelyan, everybody. The growing influence, of course, of party politics means that in reality, any claim of true impartiality is, of course, a myth. Famously, of course, Robert Vansittart claimed that the principles of the civil service and impartiality was the loyalty with which we execute ordained error. That's the Vansittart, by the way, who leaked information embarrassing to the government during the appeasement crisis and who allowed Ralph Wigham, Ralph Wigram, it's hard to say, Ralph Wigram, to leak the official documents to Churchill, which allowed Churchill so effectively to campaign against the appeasement cause. So, the genuine conflict between loyalty and independence actually leads to leaks and whistleblowing. What we see happening in the civil service repeatedly from this point forwards is in reality impartiality in the form of not rocking the boat and not challenging the political leadership. And that leads to behaviour along the lines of such as we saw during the Falklands crisis with the mass leaking of information by civil servants opposed to the policies they're being forced to support because they cannot speak truth to power, because that has been silenced within the political system. So I'm going to just whiz through that section because I don't think I need to linger on that. I want to make this point, sorry, I can always come back to if anybody wants to, but this is the point I want to stress. Now, Rodney Lowe, in the official history of the civil service, concludes that the nature of the permanent civil service in its modern meaning is not ultimately dependent on the Northcote Trevelyan report. So, of course, you all sit down and go, well, if it's not the Northcote Trevelyan report, where did it all come from? How did we end up with what we claim and what most people accept to have been relatively high standards of public service ethos within the middle of the 20th century? Where did that originate? Now, Mercia Popier, in a very interesting article, has argued about a theory of endogenous administrative reform to explain what happened. Now, I'm not excluding politicians here. Obviously, of course, I could name, I've already mentioned the name of Cardwell. Palmerston, of course, himself wants to bring administrative order and efficiency to the government. Henry Fawcett recruited large numbers of women to the post office. Adrian Mundella at the Board of Trade created the Labour Department, where, of course, Llewellyn Smith created the experts who drew forward the collectivist new liberal ideas. And even Stafford Northcote, who probably guilt by association with, you know, my enemy today, Charles Trevelyan, deserves some report because when the City of Glasgow Bank collapsed in 1878, it was him who established the position of public prosecutor to investigate and prosecute fraud cases on behalf of the state, which is the forerunner of the modern Director of Public Prosecutions. Fraud became a public rather than a private offence because of Stafford Northcote. So perhaps he deserves a bit more of a reputation than his a more illustrious compatriot in that report. So, as you can see, I believe the government inspector is crucial. In the public perception of what the standards are, we were warned this morning by Jill that, and by Sue, that the perception that these things just go on, that's just how things happen. Well, the opposite, that these are not acceptable and that better standards are possible, is also got to be investigated. How is that created? And it's created through the personal example of these figures. How about that for a statement of public ethos? You know? The magistrates don't care. The politicians don't care. The factory owners don't care. Some of their own parents don't care. And he writes back in terror, realising, I am the only instrument. I am the only person who can protect these children. That is my job. Now let's bear in mind that Horner, buried in Westminster Abbey, not many factory inspectors getting buried in Westminster Abbey, was praised by the Glasgow Herald and the Observer as the sense of self was always last with him. Doesn't that sound like the ideal public servant who we heard described earlier by Lauren, the one that, you know, Trollope seems to claim couldn't possibly exist? He was still being mentioned in the press alongside John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham and Adam Smith. He was seen as being the equivalent of them long after his death. I did another survey of the British newspapers and discovered that in the local press, his name is frequently used right up to the end of the 19th century, and in papers as diverse as the Ladies' Own paper, Social Democratic Federation's Justice, Reynolds newspaper, and of course famously in Das Kapital, he's named as the great public servant. And not just him. Amongst poor law commissioners, I even came across this, a working class public servant, somebody who rose purely through his own talent, a man in charge, who rose to be in charge of the poor law relief systems of Coventry, who was eventually appointed as a poor law assistant commissioner. He served for 34 years in the Midlands, Ireland, Wales, and the West Country. Found incredibly high levels of corruption in the Plymouth workhouse and cracked down on the embezzlement he found there amongst the guardians and the workhouse staff. His obituary, nobody's written an obituary. He's not in the ODNB. He's perhaps a bit too working class to get mentioned by such, you know, august publications. Apparently he had, his obituary, by the way, was in a local newspaper, a Coventry newspaper, said that he was in habit of disguising himself as a casual in order to fully appreciate the treatment of paupers. In other words, he went disguised as a poor person to discover how the poor were treated. So I thought George Orwell, you know, was the person who came up with that idea. But Gulson was doing it 80 years earlier, and for a political reason, rather than simply to write and sell journalism. Now, he ended up dismissing large numbers of workhouse staff and relieving officers. He supported promotion, increased salaries for those who worked in the offices effectively. And of course, as David McLean said, Gulson not only did his job well, he believed in it. And of course, Matthew Arnold. Look at this. Most factory inspectors, those schools inspectors by the end of the 20th century, didn't dare contradict what their bosses told them. But Matthew Arnold, of course, had the reputation, had the status that he could say whatever he liked. I love this quote. He did what we were strictly forbidden to do. He freely criticised, that's the revised code that insisted on payment by results. And he, in many ways, became the champion of a more liberal version of education because he had the ability to question the authority of the state's very, very utilitarian approach towards education. And of course, I could list public health inspectors, mines inspectors, engineering, lunacy, railway police, and prison inspectors into that. Tom Cook, my co-editor on the collection, famously said that the job was disciplinary and regulatory, but it was also educational, a matter of tact and persuasion. What made the inspectors exemplary modern officials was the need to get the balance right. The balance between the needs of the state and the needs of the public. Now, where else could we look for such figures? The medical officers of health, of which, of course, many have pubs named after them across the cities that I've mentioned here. These great civic figures celebrated within the press, about whom major publications are produced. The chief constables. There's nothing like corruption, of course, if we watch Line of Duty, in the police force for establishing the public interest. These figures confronted this. The entirety of the Bedworth force had to be sacked because they were all corrupt, even the superintendent. James Isaac rooted this out. In Glasgow, James Smart introduced discipline. Remember, Glasgow precedes the Metropolitan Police as the first police force. In Leicestershire, Thomas Goddard was seen as being the model. And of course, he inspired and trained other public servants. And Robert Peacock, of course, famously reformed Manchester, which I hate to point out to Stuart was the most notoriously corrupt of all the services, where it was found that the superintendent for one division wasn't merely overlooking the running of the brothels, he was actually running the brothels. And Robert Peacock sorted all that out. We could mention, of course, the Taunton Commission, coming back to the point about the regulation of charity and charity endowments. The boundary commissioners. We forget how important the early boundary commissioners were for implementing what you mentioned right at the start of the day, of relatively impartially divided constituents, which, if you think about it, the pressures on them to create, equivalent of rotten boroughs and to maintain a system of, patronage within the political system was overwhelming. Yet Thomas Drummond, of whom a colleague at the History of Parliament has written a wonderful study, completely refused to be intimidated or bribed. They did attempt both versions of this. We've mentioned T.H. Green. We could mention Arnold Toynbee. We could mention Arthur Marshall, who proved economically that inequality is bad for the economy. We could mention Llewellyn Smith, of course, who employed not only Charles Booth, but also, of course, Clara Collett, one of the great early female social investigators, who certainly wouldn't have been given the chance elsewhere. We could mention the extraordinary Black Book that exposed the extent to which institutions like the Church of England were simply failing in the job they were set out to do. We could mention Punch in its early radical days. We could mention the individual satirical journals, which, because of course they were published anonymously, couldn't be sued for libel, like Birmingham's Town Crier. That's how the Civic Gospel was born, because the Civic Gospel was born in the pages of that publication, which attacked the small-minded nature of the Birmingham councillors. Of course, we can mention Times of the Thunderer, W.T. Stead's campaigns in Pall Mall Gazette, and of course the Financial News, which exposed the corruption even in the Metropolitan Board of Works and led to its abolition and the creation instead of the far more democratic London County Council, which was created as a result of that crisis. And of course we could mention Charles Kingsley, F.D. Morris, and in Birmingham, George Dixon, who was, I found out, one of the founders of the Town Crier, the Civic Gospel itself. And I'm not suggesting this is purely a left-wing element. Think about Frederick Milner, taught by Arnold Toynbee, worked with W.T. Stead, helped to found Toynbee Hall, attempted to reduce corruption in Egypt. Okay, yes, he was a supporter of imperialism, but he believed, perhaps wrongly, that it could be reformed. And of course, the man who became Minister of Without Portfolio under Lloyd George in World War I, an attempt to bring order to the whole state. So,
yeah, we formally closed the conference 5 minutes ago.
Okay, right, yeah. So let me just finish then. My argument would be that what we actually saw in the 1850s wasn't a liberal revolution in government, which is the phrase that very unwisely James Vernon uses in his book, is we see a conservative revolution in government. And the improvement of the civil service performance is principally designed to stifle more popular demands. I'm sure many of us are old enough to remember the idea that the 1832 Reform Act was introduced to stifle more extreme demands for democratic change. That's true of civil service reform. Continued influence of Balliol College via Jowett, and more broadly Oxford and Cambridge, and of course, as was pointed out earlier, the public school educated elites who went to those institutions, meant of course that they had a monopoly, the kind of monopoly that would have made Adam Smith spin in his grave. The transfer of the colonial model of governance, trying desperately to bring everything together here, from India to Britain, was simply a case of the Indian civil service model that had been reformed by Macaulay, was changed by first Trevelyan and then Lowe, to rather one being based on race, where white administrators ruled over brown people who were not capable of ruling themselves, to one simply based on social order and class. Grammar school boys, like myself, working class people, were not capable of governing themselves. So a Brahmin class was created, a Mandarin class was created. Choose your analogies to whichever antiquated system of elite rule you want to choose, and that was created in its place. The institutionalization of the exclusive virtues and the subjective virtues of the gentleman and character and honour, of course, allowed you to eliminate anybody who you felt didn't fit. And of course, the Treasury dominated in Whitehall. So in reality, there is no true unity. Look what's happened to the current Prime Minister with all his hopes for levelling up. Well, the Treasury have put the kibosh on that, haven't they? My argument is the alternative models of reform, those proposed by figures like Chadwick and those actually implemented by people like James K. Shuttleworth and Leonard Horner, were suppressed deliberately by Trevelyan and put back the cause of genuine egalitarianism in Britain by decades, if not a century. The accountability of ministers to Parliament became a fiction. With the growth of party politics, ministers are in truth accountable to the Prime Minister. As we've seen, ultimately, if a Prime Minister wants something to happen, even wanting to abolish the Commissioner for Standards of Parliament itself, he nearly got away with that. The public service ethos, however, survived, and it survived across a range of public service professions at the coalface, and eventually even became so widespread in provincial Britain, it even permeated Whitehall, albeit briefly between about 1945 and 1988, when, of course, the powers that be very quickly clamped down on it and returned back to a system of patrician rule. I'm very sorry, I've overused my abilities as organiser there, but that's the point I'm trying to say. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for such a whirlwind and cornucopia of information, but also some very strong themes. It says closing remark, it sounds like we might have shot over them. I have one closing remark, which is that there's a kind of elephant in the room. I mean, historically and in contemporary terms, most civil services around the world are staffed by women.
Yes.
And yet much of the public service ethos that we've been hearing about today is